we're going to be talking about some of the issues affecting how data can be shared to support policy. I think we're going to come up, well, given our background as an academic publisher, there will be a particular flavour to that. But I think we've got some great speakers with a very broad take on some of the big issues around kind of data sharing and its need, and how the future can evolve. So I guess in some part, what we're going to be talking about is how we can move from the F and the A in FAIR, the findable and accessible, through the interoperable and reusable parts, so that we have a much richer data future, much more useful, and one that supports policy. So what policy means as an end use and how that affects what happens earlier in the process is something that I hope we can draw out a little bit today as well. So let me introduce the speakers. So I'll start with Jean-Claude Burgelman, who's the Professor of Open Science Policy at the Free University of Brussels. Previously at the European Commission, so most recently the Open Access Envoy, but previous to that, the Head of Unit for Open Data Policies and the Science Cloud. So we also have Martijn Poel, who's a Senior Policy Official at the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, where he works on science policy and the interaction with innovation policy. And he also has notable past roles as a policy researcher and a consultant, for example, at the Technopolis Group consultancy business. And I'd like to welcome Samia Melhem, who's the global lead on digital capabilities in the digital development practice at the World Bank, where she works on disruptive technologies and their impact and implications on policies, peoples and skills. So as an international development practitioner, she's managed some large-scale digital transformation projects in developing countries. So I hope you'll agree a really broad and deep level of expertise from our three panelists today. So I'd like to start off by asking them just a kind of an opening, very general question. So we won't have lengthy opening remarks, but to give the speakers a chance to make a few opening statements, and then we can move into some questions. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the question list, and I will definitely try to keep some time at the end to if we haven't given enough space for questions from you. So let me start with my first question to the panelists, and maybe I can direct this at Samia first. So what is it that first got you thinking about kind of the importance of how data is produced and shared in order to make it available and to support policy?
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, University of Cambridge Press, for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I've been working for more than 2 decades on digital development at the World Bank, and our objective is to increase shared prosperity and reduce poverty using disruptive technologies. So it's a very niche area for a long time, and I think a lot of our clients and policymakers were not aware of data. The tipping point was 2016, where the World Bank Development Report really went into a deep dive on the impact of the internet and digital dividends, and rose a lot of awareness on the importance of data, not only the data that we routinely collect, aggregate, and repurpose, but really interpreting it for better policies. And this year, our World Development Report is exactly on that topic, really data for better development. We are also reinforced in our mission, if you will, of data for policy with the big events in technology, not only mobile phones that more than half the world has now, the immense amount of data generated every day, and the capabilities that we have, the promising capabilities with AI for good, artificial intelligence for good, to really help us decipher the best policies to follow for a country. Do we invest in energy? Do we invest in women's education? How much do we procure of activity X versus Y? So we have a lot of data that is available today based on the last 2-3 decades of development decisions, and we sure hope we can use that for better policy making. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Samia. And maybe I could move to you, Martijn.
Thank you. Let me say a few words about my current role, and then let me refresh my memories about, as you phrased the question, go back to one of the first moments when I got into the field of data for policy. Currently, I work in science policy in the Netherlands. And here, of course, we try to support as much as possible open data and open science in general. And in my field, it also means data about science and innovation. So for instance, the strengths and the weaknesses in the Dutch knowledge infrastructure. So that's, let's say, to give you a flavor of the current statements, and I might, current activities, and I might come back to that later in the discussion. But now, going back, let's say 15 to 20 years ago, while working as a policy researcher a lot for ministries, so for clients, also working for the European Commission, already at that time, well, the challenges of open data, they became apparent. For example, we were doing at that time a lot of studies about the ICT sector or the ICT industry or about ICT research. And these annual monitors, they proved to be very, very relevant for policymakers in the sense that it's not just the report that they appreciated, but they mostly appreciated that they could come back to us every time during the year to ask for updates, analysis, disaggregated data, linked data. So then already we noticed that it's not just a one shot, a one-off, but it's ever more important to be, let's say, as an analyst, to be a partner of a policymaker. So let's say to be there, they can reach out to you, and along the year you can work with them in well, let's say phrasing and scoping the data to the extent that is relevant for them. So that already learned to me that it's more like a continuous process between analysts and policymakers, rather than it's about access to one report or one data set or having one moment in time discussions or a contract with them. So that, let's say, about 15 to 20 years ago. And later on, I can tell a little bit more about, for example, the National Research Agenda, where we try to engage policymakers in the process of phrasing research questions and doing research.
Thank you, Martin. I think we'll come to some of that from you and Samia soon, I think. So Jean-Claude, maybe I can ask you that question too.
For inviting us, for organizing this, because it's of course it's a very important topic, and anyone who doubts about the relevance of data for policy just has to study how policy has been able to react to the corona threat and to the infection, because it's only because we have abundant data on who is affected where and how and what kind of age category people are most likely to have most of the highest effects that we can calibrate our policy. So it was not swimming into, or it still is a little bit swimming into the dark, but at least thanks to the availability of all kinds of data, research, health, governance, mobility, geographically, demographics, I think we have the ability now as a global system to tackle the pandemic much faster than any one we had in the past, which normally took us 10, 15 years. So I think it's a perfect example of the importance of data for policy. And it's also a perfect example of when I was in the Commission for 20 years, we have been advocating that you need evidence for policy, because without evidence, your policy is discourse or is guessing or is at best some informed guesses. So data is extremely important, and as Sami said, we always get more data about everything because everything becomes a data point in our life, be it physical, material or immaterial. On top of that, artificial intelligence will add another exponential growth of data there, so that it is a very important policy topic to make sure that relevant data are accessible for policy. And that has led us in the Commission to push so hard for the parts which we were in charge of, namely research policy, that all publicly funded research should have open data, because you can only have data for policy if you can access the data in a way which is without any barriers, keeping in mind all the privacy and so on, other issues. So I think it's a no-brainer that data is essential for policy. It's a no-brainer that it should be open, but at the same time, and I won't come back to that, but I also think we have to be careful not to create the illusion that with evidence-based policy, meaning data-based policy, you solve all problems. First of all, you don't need data on everything. I don't need data to prove that if I jump out of a plane without a parachute, I will die. So I don't need research on that. I know that. And secondly, you still have the problem of policy, which is politics. We have data on climate change, which is very convincing, which is compelling, but that doesn't mean that the policy world is moving as fast in the direction as the data suggests it should be. But that's a different. So it remains a problem. Eh? You can objectivate it, but it doesn't mean that the rational response follows immediately.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. That's great. So I think we've already had several themes emerge in this, and I'd like to start with one about how policy as an end use of data affects how it's produced early on. So I think you could make some fairly trivial statements that, you know, data should be shared, it should be open, and I imagine in most cases most people listening would agree with that and understand in some cases it can't. But are there deeper reasons about data as a policy as an end user data should affect how people think about sharing their data, whether they're the producers or intermediaries, for example, a publishing company, to make it so that rather than being a researcher sharing with other researchers, they're sharing to a new community that they don't necessarily interact with all the time. So how does policy as an end use perhaps cause us to rethink about how data is shared and distributed? And maybe I could start with Martijn.
Okay, thank you. And indeed, you were already referring that we are to some extent preaching to the choir in this session. So indeed, some of the things are, I think, very commonly shared between us. Let me say two things. First, the accessibility of data for policymakers is, of course, sometimes more challenging than accessibility of data for fellow researchers. In the sense that for policymakers, basically, they don't have a lot of time, and when they need data, they're very pressed on time. They have to make a decision within a couple of days, or sometimes even a couple of hours. So the accessibility of data, in the sense that where it is and how you can access it, or how you can sometimes disaggregate it, or sometimes aggregate it or link it, it all needs to be done in a very short span of time. And as far as I know from the field in which I work, which is about research and innovation policy, and to some extent education policy, the data sets are not yet accessible enough. So meaning that policymakers always need an intermediary. So they need to go via a consultant or via a statistical agency. And most of the time they don't have the time to have this route. So that's where we are still well, there are some challenges there. And I'm not already sketching the solutions. That might be for the last 15 minutes, but I'm just saying that we're not there yet. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that for data to have more impact on policy, and also to be more accessible and appealable, more appealing to policymakers, the policymaker should be engaged in deciding on which data needs are there in the policy cycle. So I still see a lot of trajectories where researchers think that specific types of data are very interesting and very relevant, but they just forgot to ask the policymakers whether they agree with that or whether they might have other data needs. So for example, we have some projects where we really engage policymakers from the start, and that already helps later on for them to understand the data and to be very interested in the data and actually use it. So there's also the question of, is it more data push or is it policy demand? So these are just two things I wanted to mention here.
Matt, we've lost your sound.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got two mutes, and yes, okay, I did that. So yes, I was just saying that's this issue of you don't need data on everything, but you do need it on what you need it for. As Jean-Claude also mentioned that. So I think this is an interesting question that we can come back to. But Samia, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Matt. And I totally agree with Martijn. I want to put there the position, if you will, of my clients in developing countries where actually the problem faced is often the scarcity of data, as a lot of the procedures to generate data are still manual. paper-based and are confined to government silos or agency silos. So here we have the issue where it's, first of all, difficult to access data. Oftentimes the same data is generated over and over again by different agencies, by different agents or NGOs, not sharing it. So there's a lot of effort on collecting and less so in sharing, analyzing, and acting on it. As everybody said, data for policy. COVID, as Jean-Claude said, is really making us realize the immense gaps that we have between accessing that data and acting upon it. For the World Bank and for the whole UN system, the data we are looking at is very specific. So hence, it's supposed to make our mission easier. It's the SDG data. So we are on that mission to collect very specific data, which falls onto very specific formats. And you would think that this will make it a little bit easier later on to analyze whether it's education outcomes or socioeconomic outcomes, etc. Our task is a bit difficult because every government goes their own way, using their own tools, different digital platforms, different solutions. The open access to that data is not always part of the policy. In fact, many of my clients still have secrecy laws. So breaking, if you will, this glass ceiling of sharing the data with the innovators, the scientists, the private sector, and the NGOs is still an issue. And we've been for the last 10 years having ourselves at the World Bank an open data policy, publishing all our data, all the surveys that we have commissioned through our project. And the uptake is very large from researchers, academia, private sector, very low in terms of government. And I go back to the point Martijn was saying, which is really beefing up, strengthening the institutional capacities of our client countries, whether it's the ministries of statistics, whether it's ministries of finance, or specific verticals like health, social protection, and other sectors who really need to be a lot more fluent in reading that data and using it for their own analysis. Last, I want to say another big factor that has been helping us push that data agenda in front of us, in addition to COVID, in addition to the SDGs, is that whole movement in the last few years for identification. So really identity for all, making sure everyone gets counted, making sure that everybody is not excluded from access to public services. And that has created on its own a big push towards the collection of data on births, registering birth, registering parents, registering kids for schools. And that has also caused automatically a need for a lot of my clients in developing countries to strengthen their own capabilities to understand, let's say, biometrics, to understand electronic IDs, to understand the data that goes with it, from addresses to life events, registering birth, death, marriage, life events, etc. And that is helping us towards pushing the data agenda. So I'll stop here, Martijn.
Thank you. And Jean-Claude, do you have some additional perspectives on maybe you're thinking of the Science Cloud about how you can help get data from the producers into the hands of the policymakers and the advisors?
Yeah, well, there are two things I wanted to say there. So first of all, I fully agree with my colleagues because it's a key issue that even if you have the data, how do you communicate it? And I personally think that data visualization is the answer. Policy and politics is, I mean, I've been in that circle for 20 years and my colleagues as well. They simply don't have time. If you can't make your argument in 2 slides or 50 minutes, you can forget it. So you need to find ways to make all this huge amount of data visual in a way that it is easily or rapidly digestible. And there I think publishers, by the way, have a big role to play. Now, this being said, let me give you an example about the complexity of the issue, which we tend to underestimate because we all see data now as the holy cow of every problem, and it probably is part of the solution. But one of the examples I use to convince the European policymakers to go for the European Science Cloud is the following. If I want to investigate the impact of pollution in capital cities on asthma people, I need to combine data from health sources. I need to combine data from environmental sources. I need to combine data with traffic sources. And I need to combine data from demography. So I need 4 sets of data per city. Now, they are hardly available in the cities themselves. They are certainly not compatible in the cities themselves. So within a country, exceptions notwithstanding. And if you multiply then this by the 27 member states, which we are now, 28 when I use the example, unfortunately, you see the scale of the problem. So the data are there, but the interoperability and the accessibility is simply lacking for reasons of technical reasons, the standards, and for political reasons or privacy reasons. So, and that is something I think we can regret, but we don't live in authoritarian states. So we should try to find ways to incorporate these concerns of privacy and sensitiveness and respect of national autonomy into our data policies. Otherwise, we will never get there. And don't forget, I mean, I think that the right figure I can't recall, but we have 50% of our data production is public sector. Now, because of that, that's where we came up with our proposal. Let's create a safe haven to bring these data together in a trusted third party, if you want, where you know that if you bring for a certain question, policy or research, the data together, you know they will not be abused or they will be used for the common good. And that's what the European Open Science Cloud is. It's nothing more than a trusted third party for making sure that you don't have, because the public is very sensitive to that. They don't want their data to be used by Facebook or by Google or by God knows which provider to use it for unintended purposes. And that's the whole idea of the European Open Science Cloud.
So I'd like to. I mean, we've had some words and some concepts that have come up pretty much in every response. I think it's about how there's a lot of different data. It's complex. Different data types need to be integrated. People need to keep dipping into it. They need to look at it from different angles for different reasons. It's a very difficult problem to actually put data to practical use. I kind of think that very often when we look at the things that individual stakeholders at the moment should be doing, like publishers or researchers or the European Commission or others, it feels like these are things that must happen, but they're by no means a complete solution. So do you panelists feel that there is a fundamental need for a new technology, but something maybe AI-based or something that's very sophisticated, that can bring together different data and allow people to ask questions? So some people in the community use the words kind of knowledge engine or semantic computing, these kind of frameworks. But do you think there's a fundamental need for something really very new that will help everyone? And if so, whose responsibility do you think it is to help create that and to govern it? And Jean-Claude, maybe we could start with you again.
Yeah, well, I think it is, I don't think there is per se a fundamental need for a new technology. The example I gave you about asthma and pollution, I don't think you need a new technology to make that, to bypass that problem, because it won't bypass the problem. If the data are not interoperable, if the laws do prohibit you to combine them, you can develop whatever smart algorithm you want, you will simply have no result because you won't have access. So I think we need to do two things personally, and they're really deep policy questions rather than technology questions. So first of all, we don't need to solve all the problems for all data. I don't need to combine the data of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva of CERN with demography. So that's a completely absurd problem. So if we talk about making data available, not all data are relevant for everything. So it should be a functional approach. And we need to see, where do we need them for? And I personally, like the colleague from the World Bank said, I think that the SDGs are probably functional, huge world-spanning functional questions where we need to do an effort to bring data together. And then the second thing we need to do in order to overcome the issue of accepting that we find solutions is that we need to consider data as a common good, like airspace, like water. So only if we do that, it will be possible, I think, to convince authorities, because in the end they decide, to come up with standardization and so on. And once that is set, the solution is relatively simple. I mean, the whole Go Fair community is working on implementable standardized formats to make all these data interoperable because of working on the digital object identifiers and, you know, all these the things that the previous session has been discussing. So I think the bottleneck is not the technology, it is the policy.
Thank you. Samia, what's your answer to this question?
Well, I have to say, I totally agree with Jean-Claude. And from where I sit, the biggest issue I have faced in terms of seeing my clients struggle in terms of using data for policy is, like I mentioned from the beginning, the platforms to generate that data, and then the algorithm and the know-how to utilize them towards their objective. And talking about standardization, I have worked on so many projects around digital government, which is providing services online towards all these topics that we discussed, whether it's to generate pollution data, poverty data, health data, whether it's to track people's life cycle for government to better plan health and public education. Each country seems to follow a very different path, sometimes within the same country with two different governments coming one after the other. Everything is scratched and you start again from zero, not reusing the data generated. So the previous year's effort made using data very difficult because that whole platform building for the digital platform was a very difficult exercise. And I think in many ways, maybe the solution providers didn't help either in making it easier. Luckily, today we live at a time and place where software development is much easier. There's so much more excellent products, even in the open source space. So we can less hide behind the fact that, you know, we couldn't build such a platform. The issue is, how do we really aggregate all that data and reuse it and continue using and building the same platform despite regime changes? I think a lot of my clients are now there. The fact that you disclose the cost is a big catalyst also in how government, and I'm specifically talking about government, really rethink their data policies, especially data for the common goods. And over the last 10 years, a lot of what many donors have done is really do country diagnostic about what we call the open data readiness of any specific countries. And here we followed really good examples from the UK, from the Netherlands, Denmark, and a lot of the leading countries that have made data open by default and shareable by default. And I have to say this has influenced a lot of our client countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, where there's a lot more openness now about having open data and sharing data sets. As Jean-Claude said, a lot of that data that is less scary to share is around environment, geography, climate change, weather, and that's fine, because we are seeing wherever these country governments are opening these data sets, a lot of innovation is happening. A lot of new companies are creating mobile apps, whether it's around the tracking transport or delivering food, what have you. There's no limit, and that is helping create a lot more growth and create new jobs. Because the other point that I wanted to bring in is also data for jobs. That's an area where we are seeing a lot of potential. I mentioned earlier the lack of digital capabilities in a lot of developing countries to generate and use data. Well, a lot of this will come as data is more available and as more jobs are being created in the data space. Data scientists, data collection, data entry even. Some people frown upon that, but data entry is very big in job creation. And we are seeing countries like the Philippines, for example, who 10 years ago started to specialize in very low-end data entry, now graduate to the more advanced tiers of software development, platform hosting, etc. So a lot that can be done in that space as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Samia. So Martin, we've had two fairly clear no's to there's a lot to be done that doesn't need new technology, and we should be focusing on that. You're welcome to give your own thoughts, or we could move on. So
I'll be brief. Indeed, as you say, a lot has been said, but in the context of metadata and interoperability, I want to stress the importance of conceptual frameworks. So even closer being to what are you trying to describe with one another. And a related aspect is the community in which you discuss what you want to measure, how you want to measure it. And I'll give you one example. With a number of colleagues and data experts, we're trying to assess research and innovation in specific thematic areas. So for example, in artificial intelligence or in, let's say, technologies such as nanotechnology. First, you want to know what you mean with research and innovation or an ecosystem of research and innovation. And then using text tools, you can try to see what you can measure and want to measure in, let's say, the curriculum of universities or the research projects that are funded by the research agency or by the agency that is addressing businesses. So first you need, let's say, some sort of community and some sort of conceptual framework. And then indeed discussing data, metadata, text mining tools, data linking, etc. So I just wanted to stress the importance of the concepts and the community.
Thank you, and I think that answers some questions that I'm just seeing that we're getting about whether the role that the metadata frameworks can be helpful for governments or other groups who are starting to explore their data and to really help foster interoperability and some degree of standardization. I'd like to think a little bit about responsibilities, and forgive me for being a little bit selfish here, coming from the perspective of a publishing company. So as an academic publisher, we think about what is our role in mediating information flows from the producers to the end users, the consumers. And, by and large, we produce web pages and HTML files, and increasingly we need to make sure that we're at least linking to data and requiring that people do have something to link to, which is the data. But I wonder whether you feel that our role, our responsibilities as a key mediator in this process from producer to consumer, we should be thinking a little differently or doing something differently, or feeling that we have a responsibility that you don't think that we've been taking on before. Do you feel that we should be doing more of a role here? And if I could start with you, Samia.
I see the role of the publishers like University of Cambridge Press very much like that of the World Bank or a big multinational, the honest broker between your publishers and then your end user or your targeted beneficiaries. And I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of socializing a lot of the goods that you are promoting. In terms of perhaps translation, making sure some select article or research is really disseminated to as many people as possible, and not everybody is the English speaker. We struggle with the same. So really the translation aspect to, I would say, not vulgarize, but socialize some of the research. Here again, using some of the advanced technologies like natural language processing, some machine learning perhaps for different languages could be the next step for publishers to up their game, if you will, in terms of improving both the impact of their product but also their outreach. That could be a possibility. And as much as possible, the role of publishers in terms of making it easy to access content, making it easier to interpret, making it easier to link to other data sources, from anything like fact-checking, because again, I'm very worried about fake news, and I'm sure we all worry about that, but really the fact-checking tools that are potentially available with the disruptive technologies that we have, and creating alliances amongst publishers. Of course, publishers compete with one another, but you also have a lot of common interest, and forging some alliances towards these shared objectives, while also having partnership with the private sector also, who is also worried about the quality and of the data that they're publishing. I think this may be good next steps. And then on the research, as much as possible, and this is my wish list, I'm not speaking for anybody, but how much to involve as much as possible the diversity of researchers around the world. And some of them may not have access to you, but may have very valid data on topic X, Y, or Z. And so maybe making it easier for these researchers to access to your facilities. So that would be a very quick summary from my side. Thank you, Matt.
That's great, Samia. I've been writing down that. So it's a useful list. Thank you. Martijn.
Thank you. Well, the only thing I want to stress here, of course, is that the ambitions of publishers and the role of publishers, they can be increased. But of course, openness, in my view, the openness, this should not come at the sacrifice of, at the cost of openness. So whenever publishers try to play a bigger role, doing more than linking to, let's say, open data sources, it should not be in a way limiting access to these data sources, or being some sort of additional layer in between potential users and the data sources. But it's just a consideration that I have, while I indeed at the same time appreciate a lot how publishers can increase the accessibility of existing data sources. But for me, to keep the openness would be a key consideration. Thank you.
Jean-Claude.
Yeah, following up on that, I think it is self-evident that your first task, one of the first tasks should be that the data that underpin the publications that you publish should be made openly available in a format that is reusable, fair, and so forth. And that is certainly not the case, to put it diplomatically, today with most of the publishers. So already being manifestly active as an open data provider within the science world, because that's mainly your ecosystem, I think is a very important task. And the rest is, I cannot see how you can be involved in making public service data more available. You could of course think of developing search engines and so forth, but that I think is quite an impossible task, because anyhow Google search is much better. So and I don't say this because I like that company, but this being said, secondly, I think the whole issue of visualization, I really think there is an enormous market for visualization. The applications, tools which are context specific, which are discipline specific, which are, you know, in a certain sense, the data will become, at some point in time, we will be in a situation where we are with the internet. Everything that we publish on the internet because of HTML is interoperable. We will get there with data as well. But then the work starts, how to make sense out of all this. And that I think is where a publisher, because that's your core business, making sense out of all this is so important. So I see a lot of opportunities there. Bearing in mind what Martijn said, I think it's very important that you avoid lock-ins, so that if we use a service produced by X, we can only get the results if we stay within X, because then we are in the same situation with data where we were with open access publications 5 years ago. So that would be, I think, that's a no-go area in my view, at least for policy. So for me, these are the two big short-term, at least, areas to start working on.
Thank you. So I'm going to, I would love to delve in a little bit more about the role of technology to support visualization and keeping it open. I think that's and the role of publishers in that, and the role of the bigger groups who have the big tech companies that have some capabilities here. I find that a particularly fascinating area, but I'm going to resist the urge to delve into that, because I think something else that's come up is this issue of trust and data quality. And Samia, you suggested that publishers could have a role in quality control, and we're internally having conversations about, well, peer review, that's something that we've done for years, and should we extend that to data, and what does it mean, and what else around data quality, which isn't peer review but is very different, but is still contributes to quality. So if I could ask you each a question about, do you see that the publisher has a role in helping develop trust in data through quality control, and what possibly might that, in crude terms, what might that look like? And Martin, perhaps we could start with you.
Oof, that's a tough one, if I may admit that. I think for one thing, of course, there's quality in specific, in checking, quality control in terms of checking specific data sources, or whether the right data is used, or whether, let's say, the right data sets are combined. But my consideration would be that there's always a community of researchers, policymakers and others who are engaged with different data sources, be it from the statistical offices or from private data providers or from international organizations. And in these communities, people, let's say, together, they discuss the quality and how rigorous all the data sources are. And in these communities, I can imagine that there is a place for publishers as well to just be around, stick around, to know the limitations and the possibilities of the various data sources that are ever more being developed and also being linked. So I would take one step back and be an actor in communities, rather than, let's say, control specific types of data that are being used. I mean, that's being done, of course, as always have been the case in academic publications. But I think this more community-based approach could add value.
Thank you, Jean-Claude.
Yeah, well, again, it is, if you limit it to your let's say natural habitat, which is the scientific world, to put it bluntly and shortly, I think there is a role to play indeed to in developing quality assurance frameworks, standards, formats or schemes or whatever. But immediately they should be across the board. So it should not be Cambridge University Press developing theirs and Elsevier theirs and Oxford theirs, because then we are again in a non-compatible situation or in non-interoperability there. So the issue is that a lot of these things that we need can only be effective if there is enough scale, meaning that if it is applicable to everyone, meaning that it is a shared responsibility amongst you and your competitors. So, and that, I think, is the reason why things are not moving very fast in that area, because everyone is waiting, and I've always said inside the Commission, well, will we wait until continent X will do it, and then we will have to follow. So that's a by challenge. But anyway, and van der Leyen, by the way, today alluded on it in her speech in her State of the Union, where she alluded to that we have to develop our own infrastructure and services in Europe. So there you have a bit of a catch-22 situation, and I know from experience it's extremely difficult to have all publishers working in the same direction, to put it diplomatic again. So yes, there is an enormous demand, yes, but yes, it is not easy because it requires a cross-cutting partnership.
Yes, I'm going to, well, I may not resist the opportunity to give you my personal thought on the publishing industry's situation here, but I'm going to give Samia a chance to speak first to this.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said, that public good and common interest may not be the task of one publisher alone, but they're part of the ecosystem. And I see in Europe a much stronger enabling environment around the common good. We were talking earlier about the European Science Cloud. Jean-Claude was talking about it, around all these open data policies that are quite universal. Almost every country has the same legislation. You have the digital single market, you have GDPR. If any continent can do it with publishers and partners at that level, it would be Europe, in my view, where you have a lot more unity around what is the common good versus the individual good of countries or private sector companies, and so that would be a very good enabling environment in my view. We're not there yet. And the power of crowdsourcing, of course, involving a lot of the other players of the ecosystem, whether it's the data generating agencies, public sector, private sector, individual small companies or youth groups that are very involved with specific topics, generating data in their community. I think that would be good. It's a huge mobilizing effort. And like Jean-Claude and Martin said earlier, the biggest effort here, the biggest problem we have here is not technology. It's really all the cross-cutting areas and working together at very, very large scale. And I don't have an answer to that other than the goodwill of people for many, many years. And it's a boring answer. Nobody wants to know it. Everybody wants a magic answer. These types of efforts take decades and many, many people and those who follow them to make it happen and create the good habits of collaboration, sharing, fact-checking, and quality control. My last thought is technology is able to help us in this, that in the fact that if we have multiple data objects and platforms around the same entity, technology can help in quality check. AI can help detect anomalies, flag the wrong numbers, put the right question. And that is something that could be ultimately, I'm sure it is part of the European cloud project for scientists and researchers. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm just I can't resist the opportunity to just very briefly say I think the publishing industry, this is a big issue that it needs to figure out. And I don't know how many of my colleagues at CUP or other organisations are on the call, but they can shoot me later. But I think this is I've had many conversations over many years with colleagues, and I think the industry as a whole does need to figure out what its role is. And if it steps back or doesn't step forward, it's going to find itself with a much smaller role in information flows and its relevance to, you know, information flows and knowledge distinction is going to get smaller, and the industry cares about its role, and that's a problem. So I do think it's extremely difficult, and I do think technology is a part of it, and that the solutions to some of these problems do involve at least some degree of more, you know, not necessarily new technology, but powerful technologies put to use on it. And whether that's really in the sphere of the publishing industry to do that, I think is an open question. So I think it's really interesting, and I think our involvement with this conference, Data for Policy, is a part of that, is our learning process in some of these very difficult subjects. So I just want to spend the last couple of minutes. I think I've done a very poor job actually of mentioning people's names who have been putting questions in, but I hope people feel that I've at least tried to cover some of their points that they were raising. In the last 2 minutes, I just wanted to give the panelists an opportunity, if there's anything big, a clear message that they feel they haven't had a chance to say yet, something very short, you know, the thing that they want to communicate, let me give them a chance to do that. And if not, then I think I'll thank the speakers and we can close the session. But just very briefly, Samia, was there something I didn't let you say yet?
Matt, you've been a wonderful moderator, but I want to acknowledge 2 questions from Stefan and Firas that make my point, which is we can do a lot more. And definitely the World Bank is trying. This year's World Development Report on data. The thing is, we have to not only help our clients build their strengths and capabilities, but we have to reskill ourselves and hire data experts, data scientists, make sure that we are doing the right thing in this data-driven world, this brave new world we're going towards. So we can do a lot more, and we are trying. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Claude, any final word?
Yeah, and it's a little bit abstract, I think, and it goes back to what I said in the beginning, that we should not fall into the trap of enlightened rationalism. You know, it's not because we are working in an ecosystem that is driven by rationality and, you know, encyclopedic progress of knowledge that's how the real world works. It's actually not always like that, and we should be very careful in making sure that we use data in a way which is responsible, meaning a huge responsibility for the right way to communicate it. I really think that is an overlooked issue. And I'm not talking about public relations now, but finding the right way to convey complex messages to the key policymakers in the right format is an as big issue as interoperability. Because even if everything is interoperable, you still have to make sure that the message gets across in a way that it is not populistic. And that is, if you look around these days, exactly what we are facing.
Yeah, thank you. Martin.
Well, let me then say something with a very light note. Is that, of course, we've been very, let's say, we can be critical about publishers or researchers, but indeed, of course, I think Samia already touched on that. Let's also be critical on policymakers. And as she said, their skills, their enthusiasm in working with data, that's a challenge. But let me just conclude by mentioning a much more mundane challenge, which is for policymakers to stay on the same seat, keep sitting on the same seat for 5 or 10 years. So knowing their policy domain, knowing their data sources, knowing their community, and that already helps a lot in getting more data into the policy process.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our 3 speakers. I've certainly found it very enjoyable. I hope you have too. I will give them a round of applause for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.